This is Ijah with KUNM Radio, Spoken Word, and today I'm honored to have Tavis Smiley talking about his new book, My Journey with Maya. Tavis is the host and managing editor of Tavis Smiley on PBS and the Tavis Smiley Show on PRI. He's also the best-selling author of 18 books. So how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Wonderful. How are things in Albuquerque?
Things are good. Weather's good. We've had some rain the last couple of days, but things are wonderful now.
I grew up in Indiana. I was actually born in Mississippi, but I grew up in Indiana, and my mother keeps threatening to retire outside of Indiana, and the place she wants to retire to is Albuquerque. For some reason, she loves that city.
That's great. I love this city, too. You know, we get over 300 days of sun here, and the weather is just great. And, you dedicated the book, My Journey with Maya, to your mothers.
Yeah. I've been fortunate to have a number of mothers in my life, as it were. The mother I was referencing, my birth mother, is a beautiful woman named Joyce Smiley, who was born and raised in Mississippi. So I am from the South. I was actually born in Mississippi myself before we later moved to Indiana, where I grew up. But I was born in the South, and my mother's from there, and my grandmother and family are from that state generations back. My father is from the state of Georgia, so I am Southern through and through. My mother and my father born in the South. My mother has been such a blessing to my life. I don't know why I have been so fortunate to have a mother who has supported me unreservedly, has loved me unconditionally. And I thank God for that every day. But the greater blessing on top of the mother that I was blessed to be born to is I've had these other mothers in my life who have made immeasurable impact on the man that I am and the man that I'm still trying to become. Maya Angelou was one of those mothers, and so I dedicate the book, as you said, to my mother, Joyce Smiley, and to those other four women who have been like mothers to me, including the late, great Maya Angelou.
Thank you. And, you talking about mothers, I was reading the book, and a very interesting thing you put in the book was about how meeting Toni Morrison might have helped prepare you for meeting Maya. Would you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I met Toni Morrison when I was just a college student, and of course I love her and adore her, and do now and did then. Even more so now that I've had a chance over these years to read more of her works. But then I was just a young college student and was so anxious to meet Toni Morrison that I went to a lecture she gave at Indiana University where I was going to school. Mm-hmm. And got me a good front row seat. And when it came time for the Q&A, I just threw my hand up in the air real quick and asked her a question. And I don't even recall the question, but it was such a silly non sequitur, I suspect, of what she'd been talking about. The point of the story is that I just wanted to be in dialogue with Toni Morrison. I guess it didn't matter what my question was. I just wanted to be in conversation with her. And I could have asked a question that was a bit more in-depth, perhaps a bit more thoughtful. This is long before I became a talk show host. But I just threw my hand up in the air and asked some question that she kind of looked at me funny, and she answered the question and moved on rather quickly. And I kind of slid down in my seat because I knew that I really hadn't asked the kind of question that I perhaps should have asked. But it was more just about wanting to be in dialogue with Toni Morrison. Mm-hmm. And so years later, when I met Maya Angelou and got a chance to spend some time with her, I remembered that encounter with Toni Morrison, and I said to myself that I am not going to say nothing stupid. I'm going to speak when I'm spoken to, and I am going to make sure that I listen generously before I engage myself in any kind of conversation with Maya Angelou. So I'd already had one encounter with a world-class intellect and had embarrassed myself. And as a college student, years later as an adult, working for Tom Bradley, the mayor of the city of Los Angeles, I got a chance to meet Maya Angelou, and I just kind of remembered that moment. What was ironic about that, as I said in the book, is that I was being rather shy and reticent and quiet and wasn't really saying much. And I know it's hard to imagine Tavis Smiley being shy and reticent and quiet, but I was, because I didn't want to play myself, so to speak. But it was Maya Angelou who really brought me into these conversations, wanted to know what I think, wanted to hear my opinion on the matter, wanted to engage me in conversation that would help me re-examine my assumptions, conversation that would help me expand my inventory of ideas. But she wanted to engage me in conversation, and she didn't let the gap between our intellect, between our worldview, between our experience, between our ages, our genders, she didn't let any of those gaps keep a friendship from blossoming. And so I'm grateful to her all these years later that even though I was a little bit afraid to speak to her, she wasn't afraid to engage me in conversation.
Wonderful. You talk about the book being about friendship and love and courage, but it also strikes me as being a book about humility, being humble. That's one of the things I really pick up, like you say, with your brush with greatness and being in the presence of an intellectual, a great icon, It shows me that you're a really humble person. I appreciate that.
Well, I have a dear friend of mine who says all the time that before honor comes humility. Before honor comes humility. And we live in a world that is driven by ego, and I'm the first to admit that I have ego like anybody else, and you can't do what I have done in my life. You can't, be a best-selling author and be a talk show host on TV and radio and all the things I've been blessed to do. You can't do that without having some sort of ego.
Mm-hmm.
And I think ego in check is healthy. I always make a distinction for people between confidence and cockiness.
Yes.
Some people are cocky and some people are just confident. And nothing wrong with being confident in the gift and skill and the talent that God has given you. But having said that, before honor comes humility. And I just believe that gratitude is the gateway to greatness. Gratitude is the gateway to greatness. So if you can find a way to use the gift and skill and talent you've been blessed with, to use it in love and service to other people, to remain humble with that gift, because keep in mind now, it is a gift. This ain't something you gave yourself. You didn't birth yourself. You didn't create yourself. You didn't educate yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we are who we are. Every one of us, we are who we are because somebody loved us. It might not have been the person who should have loved you, but every one of us is who we are because somebody chose to love us. And in that, we ought to remain humble. We ought to remain grateful. And I believe, again, that gratitude ends up being the gateway into greatness.
Thank you. You talk about how Maya's great mission was to demonstrate how courageous love can heal even the deepest wounds, and how she taught you about bravery and listening and language. Talk about that great woman a little bit.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine all these years later, almost 30 years of a friendship with her, and she passed away at the age of 86. It is hard to imagine a young girl being raped at the age of 7 as she was. Anyone who has read her book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, knows this story. Of course, it is the first of her many memoirs. But I can't imagine a 7-year-old girl being raped by the boyfriend of her mother. And as a result of that rape and his subsequent murder for raping her, she went mute. As you know, she didn't say a word for 5.5 years. For 5.5 years, she did not utter a word. To say that Maya Angelou eventually found her voice would be the mother of all understatements. Clearly, she found her voice. But more than just finding her voice, the fact that she remained so humble and so gracious and so kind and so generous and so charitable, that she lived a life where every day she was striving to become better and not bitter. There's so many lessons that she can teach us if we look at her life, look at her legacy, her work, and her witness. And again, I don't know why I was blessed to be one of her many sons and daughters. I don't know why it is that she brought me into her world and gave me all this kind of access and this kind of love and attention and shared her wisdom and insights with me. Again, I remain grateful for it. She is the quintessential example of what it means to live a life where we grow, where we mature, and where we ultimately come to figure out that love really is the answer. But for her to have figured that out, starting out as a child being raped, it's quite a journey. It's quite a journey.
It's quite the journey. It's interesting. Before you went to Africa with her, you were working for, like you say, Mayor Tom Bradley, and you had gone through some rejection.
Yeah.
So you met her at the right time in your life.
Oh, man, timing is everything, as they say. I had worked for Tom Bradley, had run for city council after working for the mayor, had run for city council in Los Angeles, lost that council race. I was just a kid in my 20s. It's hard to imagine, and it's almost laughable that all these years later, I thought my life was over because I didn't know what the next step was. Laughable now because I've been able to, to cover so much more ground since then. But at the time, I didn't know what the next step in my life was. All I really wanted to be was a public servant. Dr. King was and still is my hero. And I wanted to honor his life and legacy by being a public servant, by living my life in love and service to other people as he did through public service. And so that's why I ran for city council. I wasn't trying to, make a name for myself, and I really wanted to be a public servant. Earlier in my life, my first little work-study job when I was just a kid, a teenager, I worked for a city councilman in my hometown of Kokomo, Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
So public service was in my blood, and I really wanted to just love and serve people. And this local councilman that I worked for as a kid, was beloved in our community because he was the quintessential example of what it means to be a public servant. He took care of the little people in this town that I grew up in. And so L.A., a much larger stage, but I had the same noble goal, which was to be a public servant in the tradition of this guy, Douglas Hogan, who I'd worked for when I was just a kid. And so to lose that council race in my 20s, I was lost, man. I didn't just lose the race, but I was lost. I couldn't find my voice. I couldn't find my way. I didn't know my place in the world. I was depressed. I was despondent. I had left the mayor's office to run for this city council seat. So I was unemployed. I had campaign debt from having lost the race. I was about to be evicted out of my apartment. I couldn't pay my rent. It was a deep and dark and desolate kind of period for me, even though I was just a kid. Again, I just didn't know what to do next. And it was in that moment, in that very moment, in that space, that I get this invitation to travel to Africa for 2 weeks with Maya Angelou. And I was essentially just carrying her bags around. But it was the joy of my life to be able to go to Africa. I had never left the country, so here I am leaving the country for the first time. I'm going to Africa. I'm going to Africa with Maya Angelou. And while we're in Africa, I'm hanging out with Maya Angelou and Stokely Carmichael and John Henry Clark and Miriam Makeba and the president of Africa at the time, president of Ghana, rather, Jerry John Rawlings. So here we are in Africa, and all this is happening for me at this very moment that back in Los Angeles, I'm completely untethered. But that trip to Africa for almost 2 weeks, my very first trip to the continent, opened my eyes in so many ways. And it was on that trip, back to your question, after telling Maya Angelou what had happened to me in Los Angeles and what was happening in my life and world at this particular moment, she said to me that, sweetie, sometimes rejection is redirection. Mm-hmm. Sometimes in life, rejection is redirection. What you see this loss as being rejected by the voters, and it may have been rejection. But sometimes rejection is redirection. It's God's way, the universe's way of moving you into a new path, moving you in a different direction. Long story short, she couldn't have been more right because in retrospect, while it hurt like all get out at the time, in retrospect, I am glad I lost that council race.
Yes.
And the fact that I've been blessed to do so many other things on the national stage, on the international stage, and the fact that I found my voice and I've been able to do what I've done in broadcast media and through the written word and through my philanthropy and just so much other work on poverty, I am grateful that I was rejected at that point, because that rejection redirected my life, and I've been able to do, I think, what I've been called to do.
Well, she certainly saw your potential, I guess, at a very early age, like you say, in your 20s.
Yeah.
And even though you'd been rejected, she saw that you're going to blossom at some point.
Yeah, thank God for it, trust me.
But, you mentioned meeting Stokely Carmichael. I got a chance to meet him once here in Albuquerque.
Oh, Lord, yes.
And one of my favorite pieces of celebrity memorabilia is a letter that I got from him. I gave him a hat when I met him, and he had his staff write me back a letter saying he appreciated the hat. And I'll always cherish that letter,
Oh, as you should. He's a great hero. He is a great hero.
He's a great hero. And, and also you talked a lot about Maya's time with Malcolm X in Africa. Would you just talk a little bit about her meeting with Malcolm?
Yeah, the great thing about this trip was that I had a chance again to sit at Maya's feet and to listen to her and others in conversation. And again, I was just a kid, so I was basically sitting in the corner listening and taking all this in and just loving every minute of it, and mostly speaking when I was spoken to. Mm-hmm. But I was happy to just listen to these geniuses talk and share with each other. Maya had lived in Ghana earlier in her life, and so she was returning to Ghana, essentially, and they rolled out the red carpet for her return, and I just happened to be on this trip with her. But because she'd lived there, she had a lot of friends, two that come to mind immediately, John Ray and Mary Ellen, who I talk about in the book, who had been her friends when she lived there years prior. And so to sit and listen to them talk about what the good old days were like when she lived in Ghana. And while she was living in Ghana, Malcolm had come to visit, and Julian Mayfield was there, and Muhammad Ali had come through Ghana. So to listen to them tell these stories about Malcolm and Ali and other American expatriates who were living in Ghana at the time was just wonderful. It was beautiful. And she, of course, wrote about these experiences in her works and in her books. But to sit, it's one thing to read her writing about these moments. Another thing to sit and to listen to her and her friends in conversation about these moments. And it was beautiful just to sit and listen to her talk about her friendship with Malcolm. Maya was unique in that she was friends with both Malcolm and Martin. Mm-hmm. As I said earlier in this conversation, Dr. King has always been my hero, and I have such great respect and admiration for Malcolm X. Yes. And to have, come upon this relationship with Maya Angelou, who was friends with so many of the people who I wish I had known. She really becomes, as I say in the book, my cosmic connection to people I wish I had known. So it's through talking to Maya that I feel like I know, or I'm in the space of Martin King and Malcolm X and Jimmy Baldwin, as she called him. I know him as James Baldwin. She knew him as Jimmy. Jimmy Baldwin and Nina Simone and so many other people I just wish I had known Maya was personal friends with. And so, again, she becomes my sort of connection to the past, and she brings that past to life for me through these stories because she's such a great storyteller.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the reason why she was going there to give a speech about Dr. Du Bois. I think he had a Ph.D. from Harvard, didn't he, around the turn of the 1900s?
Absolutely. The first African-American to receive a Ph.D. from Harvard. Du Bois is the first African-American to receive a Ph.D. from Harvard. He becomes the first noted black intellectual, of course. Later in his life, though, when he was fed up with America, as you know, he left the country and moved to Accra, Ghana, and that's where he died. A quick bit of trivia. Du Bois passed away in Ghana, and back then we didn't have these cell phones and email, and information did not move like the speed of light or sound. So Du Bois passed away in Accra, Ghana, and it took a while for the word to get back to the States that he had died in Africa. And interestingly, for history buffs, they will be happy to know or to remember that the announcement of Du Bois' death in Ghana was made by A. Philip Randolph during the March on Washington in 1963. So the country came to know that Du Bois had passed away in Africa. I think about that, and it gives me chills to think that the timing of Du Bois' death coincides with the historic March on Washington, and it was at the march that A. Philip Randolph made the announcement that Du Bois had passed away in Africa. And so we're going to Africa. I'm traveling to Africa with Maya Angelou, and there are a number of things on her itinerary, but the main event is a lecture that she is going to give at the Du Bois Institute. And the Du Bois Institute is housed on the grounds where Du Bois lived and worked. The Du Bois estate is essentially the home of the Du Bois Institute. And so Maya was giving this wonderful speech in tribute to the life and legacy of Du Bois, giving the speech at his institute. And when I learned that the institute was on the grounds of his house, obviously I came to figure out I'm going to Du Bois' house. And it was just too much, man, to be at Du Bois' house. Maya's giving this speech. The president of the country is on the front row. Stokely Carmichael is there. Miriam Makeba is there. John Henry Clark is there. Others are there. Dr. Ruth Love, Dr. Julianne Malveaux, who I've traveled with to Africa. We're all there, and we're at Du Bois' house. And again, it's a trip and a journey that I'll never forget. But it was on that trip to Africa that my 28-year friendship with Maya Angelou started to blossom. And again, I remain grateful for the entire relationship. But that trip to Ghana was something that is etched in my not just in my mind, but in my heart.
Thanks for sharing those thoughts on Dr. Du Bois. I
Yeah.
read his book, The World in Africa, and it changed my life.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Now, when you return from Africa, and just talk about re-entering in America, and then how that trip might have been a spark to take you where you are today.
Well, Maya talked to me about, before we left, she knew I'd left the country for the first time on this trip to Africa, and she had a nice conversation with me about re-entry. She had done this any number of times, and she really wanted me to understand that things wouldn't be the same for me when I got back, that I needed to have a re-entry plan, that I needed to consider what this trip meant. And we talked, for a good bit about literally re-entering the country. And I'm so grateful that we did, because I was a bit, depressed when I got back, but I had such a great time in Africa. And at that point, I'd fallen in love with Maya Angelou. And all I really wanted to do for the rest of my life was just hang around her. If I could just sit at her feet for the rest of my life and work for her, I would have been happy just doing that, hanging out with her every day.
Yes.
But I had to get back to California, back to L.A., and to get my life, started. But her saying to me that rejection is redirection, that helped me a lot. I held on to that. And she also said to me that we find our path, Tavis, by walking it. Mm-hmm. We find our path by walking it. So it was abundantly clear to me that this wasn't going to happen for me magically or mysteriously. I'm going to have to do the work. You got to walk your path.
And that, to me, that means not being afraid, not overcoming your fears.
That's right.
Go ahead.
That's exactly right. It means what you just said. It means not being frozen by fear. Mm-hmm. It means realizing that there is a role for you, that you do have a voice. There is a calling on your life. Now, you got to go back and figure out what that is. But do not assume that just because you lost this council race, there's nothing for you to do. And in the speech that she gave at the Du Bois Institute, she kept using this beautiful refrain that her speech was built around. And the line and the refrain was that we have already been paid for. Mm. We have already been paid for. The blood, the sweat, the tears, the sacrifice, the struggle, the service, the millions of bodies of our ancestors that lie at the bottom of the Atlantic who didn't make it through the Middle Passage, we have already been paid for. And because we've been paid for, there is a debt that we owe. It is a debt that we will never be able to repay, but we must at least use our lives to make a down payment on the debt that we can never fully repay. And so I knew that I had a mission. I had work to do. And I got back to L.A. and started to figure some things out. And I got to work, on trying to walk that path. And long story short, the next time I saw Maya Angelou, I talked to her on the phone. Mm-hmm. The next time I actually saw her face-to-face was 2.5 years later, when she was appearing as a guest on my national TV program. So things had come full circle, and from that point on, we just continued to develop and build our friendship. And the times that we spent together, and nights spent at her home, and she coming to visit me, and dinners, and time together with her on her bus. I mean, there was a lot of moments that we spent together. But I can't find a word other than grateful for all the time that she gave me.
So, returning, you started working with radio shows. I mean, how one event or one experience or circumstance led to another. You even landed a job at BET and then got fired. And
went to BET, got fired, and even that firing was an occasion for her to say to me that you got to be grateful for this. Mm-hmm. You should send Bob Johnson, who at the time owned BET. She said you ought to send Bob Johnson a letter
and
tell him thank you for firing you, because this is going to open up all kinds of doors for you. I didn't see it that way in the moment, but she was right. Mm-hmm. It opened up doors, and then came PBS, and then came NPR, and then came a number of New York Times best-selling books, and all these things happened because it was, I had 5 good years at BET. It was time to move on and do something else. Mm-hmm. Again, you can't be afraid to take that next step to move on. And so that was a moment. But throughout the book, I tell these stories of moments and incidents where I didn't understand what was happening to me. I needed advice. I needed counseling. I needed somebody to converse with. And Maya always seemed to show up in my spirit when my soul required repair. She was always there. So the book is the journey that we took together of these stories and moments and incidents and just good times And there are moments that we agreed, moments that we disagreed. Those stories are in there as well, the things that we disagreed about. But even in our disagreements, every conversation always ended on a love note. Mm-hmm. And the fact that someone of her stature would allow me to disagree with her, would invite me to interrogate her, wanted to have, a back and forth, so we came to some understanding about these issues. She welcomed that. And again, for a world-class intellect of her stature, to allow me to disagree, to welcome me to interrogate her, to want to engage me in these kinds of conversations where sometimes we'd go back and forth on the issues of the day. It was a beautiful thing. So it helped grow my confidence in my own ability to make my case on a particular issue, but it also allowed me, again, to remain humble, to never forget that I'm talking to my Angelou, and to make my case, but to always be respectful of the opinion and the situation that the other person is in. She taught me a valuable lesson about the difference between sympathy and empathy. Mm-hmm. People don't need your sympathy. They want your empathy. They want you to be able to put yourself in their shoes and understand what their situation, their condition, their suffering is all about. So it's a book, that lays out all of that. And I hope, in the final analysis, I hope, before I run here, I hope that people will get a chance to read the book, My Journey with Maya, and be able to situate themselves in the story. I said earlier, and I'll close where we started. I'll close on this note. We are who we are because somebody loved us. And I am who I am because Maya Angelou loved me. And I know many people loved her, revered her, adored her, respected her, admired her. Some got to meet her, some didn't. But this book will take you inside her world, where you get a chance to see what she was really like when she wasn't on stage, and what it was like to have been a young man sitting at her feet, and what I learned from her. And I think the lessons that I learned, that I pass on in this book, are lessons that will inspire and empower and uplift others as they live their lives. And so I'm grateful again for the 28 years I had with her. I'm grateful that Little Brown gave me the chance to write the book and tell the story. I'm delighted that so many people are picking up the book and reading it, again, and finding themselves in the story. But ultimately, it's a celebration of the life and legacy of Maya Angelou, who I regard, finally, as the greatest Renaissance woman in the history of this country. I do not know a woman who has done so many things and done so many things well. Poet, author, lyricist, actor, director, dancer, choreographer, professor, best-selling cookbook. She was a great chef. I mean, I've never known anyone to do so many things and do so many things exquisitely well. And so I just am grateful that I had the chance to spend this time with her, and I'm grateful that I had the chance to spend the time with you. I know we met briefly running through an airport.
Yes, sir.
And for you to have met me and to invite me on your fine program and to give me this opportunity to talk about this book is something, again, that I am grateful for. Thank you. Give my best to your lovely bride and to your precious daughter.
Thank you.
And I so appreciate the opportunity to be on this program today.
Thank you. We've been talking to Tavis Smiley about his new book, My Journey with Maya. Yes, Tavis Smiley. Fabulous read, fascinating read. And I can see why you always end your shows with Keep the Faith, because this has been a great, great opportunity. Thank you so much.